The teacup had been there since Tuesday morning, still half full, a thin, dark ring forming at the waterline, the handle pointing east toward the garden wall, as if the hand that had set it down fully intended to return. But the hand never did. Welcome to Mystery Stories, where every shadow hides a secret, and every cup of tea may be your last. Settle in, pour yourself something warm, and let the story begin. Chapter 1. A Village That Knows Its Own Business. The village of Ferngate Crossing had a way of noticing things. Not loudly, not in any organized fashion, and certainly not in any manner that could be described as deliberate or concerted. It simply noticed. The way a village does. The way old stones notice the weather. The way a well-kept garden notices a stranger at the gate. The way certain people notice everything they see and say nothing at all, and then later, when the moment arrives, turn out to have been watching all along. It was a village of perhaps 300 souls, settled comfortably into a fold of the Cotswold Hills in the manner of something that has been there a very long time and intends to remain. The high street was honey-colored limestone, the walls built from stone quarried from the hill above the village in a period when men understood that a building ought to come from the place where it stood. The post office smelled, as it always smelled, of rubber stamps and digestive biscuits and the faint citrus hand cream favored by its postmistress. The public house was called the Lamb and Anchor, and its sign had been repainted so many times over the centuries that the lamb on it now wore an expression of faint, dignified surprise, as though it had expected something rather different from life and had arrived at a state of philosophical accommodation. The church had been marking the hours since 1387, or so the guidebook said in its small and earnest way, and its bells went about this work with the particular imprecision of very old bells, which is to say that they were broadly correct about the hours and had their own opinions about the quarter hours, and the village had long since stopped expecting anything more. On damp mornings especially, when the air hung close and soft between the hills, the bells had a tendency to come in late by anything from 30 seconds to 2 minutes, and the village accommodated this with the tolerance of people who have accommodated it for several generations and have found it rather more charming than inconvenient. Above the village, the hills were the soft October green of a landscape that is not yet committed to November. Below, the fields were stubble gold and plowed earth, and the occasional startling white of a farm building catching the morning light. The lanes between were lined with hedgerows in the full, complicated glory of their autumnal decline. Blackberries long since surrendered to the birds, rose hips jeweling the gray stems, elders stripped clean by creatures who knew about winter before the almanacs did. It was, in short, a very English place at a very English time of year, and it knew itself well, perhaps a little too well, with the unsentimental self-knowledge of communities that have been exactly themselves for a very long time. Ferngate Crossing had seen things come and go. It had absorbed a considerable amount of human drama with the patient tolerance of a landscape that has learned not to be astonished by people, and it watched, always, in the unhurried way of something that has nowhere else to be. There was, on the far edge of the village green, separated from the green itself by a low stone wall and a small cultivated rectangle that was part path and part flower bed, a cottage called Wisteria End. Its name referred to the enormous wisteria vine that consumed its front wall each spring in a cascade of purple so extravagant that visitors to the village sometimes stopped on the pavement and simply stood and stared, hands at their sides, slightly undone by the botanical generosity of it. The vine had opinions about the structure of the house. It had reached the chimney pot on at least one occasion within living memory, and had been brought back from there with considerable discussion, and what amounted to negotiation between the vine and whoever had been responsible for it at the time. It took up space, that vine, in the way of things that have been somewhere long enough to regard it as theirs. In autumn and winter, when the vine had retreated to its gray and skeletal self, the cottage looked smaller and more private, like a person who has removed a very flamboyant hat and turned out to be quieter underneath it than you expected, and more themselves. Miss Jane Marple, who had come to Ferngate Crossing the previous April to visit her second cousin Lavinia Partridge, and had stayed rather longer than either of them had anticipated. The spring had been so lovely, and then the summer had been so mild, and then somehow October had arrived and there had been no particular moment at which it had seemed necessary to leave. Had come to know Wisteria End with the quiet, accumulated knowledge of someone who passes the same place several times each week and pays attention without making anything of it. She walked to the early church service 3 mornings each week. This walk took her past the cottage at a distance of perhaps 8 feet. She had therefore seen Wisteria End in most of its moods, over 7 months of morning walks, with frost on its windowsills and mist about its wisteria, with the postman's van outside on Tuesday mornings, and the grocery delivery on Fridays, with its sitting-room curtains open by 8 and shut by dark, as reliable as any clock, with its front garden in various states of progress through the growing season, and, on warm evenings when she sometimes walked later than was her habit, with the warm gold light in its windows that spoke of a single person living in it carefully and contentedly. Alone. She had seen the occupant herself, on perhaps a dozen occasions, a woman of 60 or so, trim and upright, with the unhurried way of someone who has arranged her life around her own preferences, and has been doing it long enough that the arrangement is entirely natural. She had a purposeful stride and a quiet manner, and she did things in her garden with the attentiveness of someone who finds the work itself satisfying rather than merely the outcome. She kept, so far as Miss Marple could judge from passing observation, the routines of a person who has found what suits them and is content with it. The curtains had been shut for 4 days now. Every window, every curtain, every morning, she passed. That in itself meant nothing. People went away. People had family commitments and minor indispositions, and the occasional and entirely legitimate need to close their curtains against the world for a day or two. Miss Marple was not the appointed guardian of other people's domestic arrangements. She was an elderly woman taking a walk, which was all. But the teacup on the windowsill, the outside windowsill, which is not where a teacup belongs under any ordinary circumstances, had been there since Tuesday. She had first noticed it on Tuesday morning. Today was Saturday. 4 days, which in October and in this climate means 4 nights of cold, 2 of which had been damp, and 1 of which had involved the kind of rain that is serious about its intentions. The tea in the cup had gone a color that no tea ought to achieve. The milk, on Thursday morning when Miss Marple had paused to adjust her scarf against the wind, had formed the thin, unhappy skin of something undisturbed for many hours. That particular surface that speaks, more reliably than any clock, of time passing unremarked in a still place. People did not leave teacups on outside windowsills for 4 days in October. Not by accident. Not without noticing. The sort of person who maintained a garden with the attentiveness she had observed over 7 months was not the sort of person who mislaid a teacup on a window ledge and forgot about it until it grew a weather event. Miss Marple walked on. She said nothing to anyone that morning, but she turned the matter over in her mind the way she turned most things, slowly, without forcing, letting the various pieces settle into their natural relationships with each other, trusting that if there was a pattern it would eventually make itself known. The church bells rang the quarter hour, or something in the general vicinity of the quarter hour, and a robin on the post office chimney cocked its head at the sound with the expression of a bird that has heard this performance before and has arrived at a position of tolerant affection toward it. Chapter 2. Mrs. Lorne, and the art of knowing everything. The postmistress of Ferngate Crossing was a Mrs. Edna Lorne, a small woman of approximately 62, who wore her silver hair in a bun of such architectural precision that it appeared to be load-bearing. Remove it, you felt, and something structural would give way. Not just the hair, but the whole careful edifice of her professional authority, her social standing, and the 31 years of excellent service to the postal requirements of the village that had built both. She was not a vain woman. She was a woman who understood that presentation is a form of respect, and who applied it consistently and without fuss, the way she applied everything else. She had been postmistress for 31 years. In that time, she had sold approximately 400,000 stamps. This was an estimate, but a considered one, forwarded rather more parcels, and accumulated a working knowledge of the village's affairs that was, in Miss Marple's private assessment, very nearly encyclopedic in its range, its organization, and its accessibility. Mrs. Lorne could tell you, without apparent effort, who lived at every address in the village, what their circumstances were in a general way, what they received through the post and from whom, whether they had family elsewhere and in which direction, and whether anything about their recent behavior had diverged from their established pattern. This was not gossip. That was the important distinction, and Miss Marple was careful about it. Gossip derives pleasure from the difficulties of others and seeks to circulate information for the reward of being the one who has it. Mrs. Lorne derived no particular pleasure from what she knew. She knew it because information came to her, the way the river at the bottom of the hill collected water, naturally, continuously, not by effort or intention, but simply because the landscape of her position made it so. She was the postmistress. The village's written communications passed through her hands. People came in and stood at her counter and talked, because people always talk in post offices, which are among the last genuinely communal spaces in village life. She listened, and she remembered. She was, in this sense, a natural archivist. On the Saturday morning in question, Miss Marple arrived at the post office at 9:20, a little earlier than was strictly necessary for the single letter she had to post to her niece in Exeter, and bought a book of second-class stamps. She did this with the pleasant, unhurried manner of someone who has found the post office thoroughly satisfactory as a place to be and is in no particular hurry to leave it. "Good morning, Mrs. Lorne." "Good morning, Miss Marple. Rather nippy today, isn't it? Large letter stamps or the ordinary?" "Ordinary will do very well, thank you." A brief, warm, companionable silence settled over the post office counter. The kind of silence that is not empty but full of the sense of two people who are comfortable in the same space and who may or may not have something to say, but are in no hurry to say it, before it is ready. The post office smelled as it always did of rubber ink pads and the faint ghost of something citrus. The radio behind the counter was playing a string quartet at a courteous, background-appropriate volume. "I noticed something this morning," said Miss Marple, in the tone of someone making a mild observation about the light or the state of the lane, "that I've been noticing for a few days now. There's a teacup on the outside windowsill of the cottage at the far edge of the green, the one with the wisteria vine. Wisteria End. I believe a Miss Hendricks lives there?" "Dorothy Hendricks," said Mrs. Lorne, immediately and with a slight tightening at the corners of her eyes that Miss Marple observed with careful interest. "She's been in the village 12 years. Retired schoolteacher from Bristol, secondary school, geography. She paints watercolors. Very serious about it. Very quiet woman generally, keeps to herself, but not unfriendly about it. She comes in every Thursday for her pension and occasionally for packaging materials. She sends parcels fairly regularly. Correspondence that goes out through here, not very much. She is not, by nature, a great writer of letters. She did not come in this Thursday?" Mrs. Lorne paused in her handling of the stamps. Not a long pause, but a specific one. The pause of someone who has already noticed something and is deciding what to do with the fact of having been asked about it. "No," she said. "She didn't. I thought perhaps she wasn't feeling well. The damp has been getting into things this week. I thought," she stopped. "You thought of going round," said Miss Marple gently. "I thought about it." A small, candid admission from a woman who is not often uncertain about her right to intervene on behalf of general welfare. "But Miss Hendricks, she's a private sort. She doesn't always welcome what she calls fussing. She said that to me once. About somebody else. And I took note of it. I didn't want to give offense." "I quite understand," said Miss Marple. "Before Thursday, in the past week or so, had you seen her? When was she last in? Monday, I'm fairly certain. Or possibly Tuesday morning. I was busy on Tuesday, and I'm less sure about the exact order of things. She came in for brown paper and string, a good amount of each. She was posting a parcel. larger than her usual. She seemed mildly surprised by the postage, which was considerable. Mrs. Lorne frowned in the way of someone consulting a very reliable internal record. The address was, I'm trying to recall, not local. Exeter area, I believe, or thereabouts. And when she was in, did she seem quite herself? Nothing unusual about her manner? She seemed, Mrs. Lorne considered this carefully, with the scrupulousness of someone who does not like to be inaccurate. Preoccupied. But that's not unusual for Miss Hendricks. She has a thinking kind of face, if you know what I mean. She always looks as though part of her mind is elsewhere, working on something. It doesn't mean anything is wrong. It is simply how she is. A pause. She did come in and out of the door twice, without quite meaning to. She'd left, and then she came back in for something she'd forgotten to ask, and then she left again. She seemed to have her mind on other things. Miss Marple received her stamps and her change, and admired the small autumn arrangement in the post office window. Someone had put together a clever grouping of leaves and dried seed heads in bronze and amber, and an extraordinary assertive yellow that was somehow making the whole thing work. And went back out into the Saturday morning. The air had the clean mineral smell of post-rain stone. There was bonfire smoke somewhere on the hill behind the church. A pair of jackdaws on the green were conducting some territorial negotiation of their own, with the focused and slightly theatrical intensity that jackdaws bring to most undertakings. Miss Marple walked toward the lane that led home and did not say anything further to herself or to anyone else about Miss Hendricks or the teacup on the windowsill. But she made a decision, of the quiet and unannounced sort that she generally made, the sort that simply settles into place, occupying the position in her thinking where it belongs, requiring no particular ceremony of deliberation. She would call it Wisteria End. She was a neighbor, or near enough. It was entirely natural for a neighbor to knock at a door when she had been concerned. Chapter 3. The Door That Answered Incorrectly. The front path of Wisteria End was made of old red brick, worn smooth in the center where feet had passed for 100 years, and softened at the edges by moss, the small, dark, patient moss of sheltered places, which is not the failure of maintenance, but the mark of time, and is in its own way rather beautiful, if you are the sort of person who finds age beautiful, which Miss Marple generally was. The garden on either side had the look of a garden that is genuinely cared for, not the impersonal tidiness of a garden managed by someone who has been paid to keep it correct, but the specific and characterful tidiness of a garden that belongs to one person who loves it and makes decisions about it, and whose personality is present in it, in the choice of roses along the left side, in the clipped but not severe hedge at the front, in the small bird bath by the right-hand wall, whose stone had gone a beautiful gray-green with weather and lichen. Or rather, it had been that kind of garden. Miss Marple walked up the path on the Saturday morning and observed, without hurrying the observation or imposing conclusions upon it, that the roses along the left side had not been attended to in perhaps 10 days. Not dramatically neglected, they were not running wild, there was no sudden disorder, but overdue for the kind of regular, careful attention that a person who genuinely loves their roses provides as a matter of course, the way you would notice if a friend had not brushed their hair. The roses were due for attention. They had not had it. Something had interrupted the attention they were used to receiving. The welcome mat before the front door was displaced. Not dramatically, not fallen over, not as though a struggle had occurred in the doorstep area. Simply moved slightly to the left of where a welcome mat is placed when someone places it with care. It had been nudged by the passage of feet, more feet than usual, perhaps, or feet moving with more haste than usual, and had not been straightened, and the teacup was still on the outside windowsill to the left of the door. It had rained Thursday night, quite seriously, and the teacup was fuller than it had been on her inspection 2 days prior. Not with tea, the tea was long past any state that could be described by that word, but with October rainwater. The cup sat there in the morning light, this quiet object in entirely the wrong place, and Miss Marple looked at it for one brief moment before she raised her hand and knocked. She waited. Inside the cottage, the small ambient sounds of occupancy. A house that is not empty. A house that has someone in it, moving carefully. She knocked again, with slightly more firmness. Not loudly, not in any way that could be construed as aggressive or alarmed. Simply the knock of a person who is aware she has been heard and is letting the person who heard her know that she is going to wait. The door opened. Not wide, 8 inches perhaps. Held there by a security chain, engaged fully, attached properly, performing precisely the function it was designed to perform. Through the gap there appeared a face that Miss Marple had not expected to see, because it was not the face of Miss Hendricks. It was a young woman. Perhaps 28. Dark-haired, the hair pulled back quickly, without particular attention. She was pale, whether naturally or circumstantially, whether this was her complexion or the consequence of recent days, was not immediately clear. She had good cheekbones and a wide, expressive mouth that was currently being held in a state of careful blankness. She was wearing dark clothes, practical, unremarkable, and she was looking at Miss Marple through the 8-inch gap with the precise and practiced neutrality of someone who has decided to see what this is before deciding what it is. Not rude, not aggressive, not frightened, or rather, not showing it, which was a different thing and possibly the more significant one. The neutrality of someone who is waiting to assess. "Yes?" she said. "Good morning," said Miss Marple, with the warm and genuine smile that she generally wore for this sort of occasion, which was the warmth of someone who means it and is quite easy about the situation. "I'm so sorry to disturb you. My name is Marple, I'm staying with my cousin on the other side of the green, and I usually pass this way on my morning walk. I sometimes exchange a word with Miss Hendricks. I've been a little concerned, not having seen her recently. Is she quite all right?" A brief pause. The young woman was doing something internal, assessing, categorizing, deciding. "She's not here at the moment," she said. "She's had to go away. A family matter." "Oh, I am sorry to hear that," said Miss Marple, in a tone of mild and entirely non-specific concern. "Nothing serious, I hope?" "Just a family matter," said the young woman again. The same phrase. The second use of exactly the same formulation, which is never quite so reassuring as the first, because the first is information and the second is a position. Of course. Miss Marple looked at the young woman through the gap with the comfortable, patient interest of someone who is quite happy to wait. "And you are a friend." "I'm keeping an eye on the place." A slight pause. "Was there anything else?" "Not at all," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "Just wanted to be sure everything was in order. Do give my regards to Miss Hendricks when she returns. Just say Miss Marple, from the morning walks. She'll know who I mean." "Of course," said the young woman, and closed the door with the careful, controlled quietness of a person performing an entirely ordinary social action and wishing very much for it to be perceived as entirely ordinary. Miss Marple stood for a moment on the displaced welcome mat. She looked at the door, now shut. She looked at the windows, curtained. She looked at the teacup on the outside sill to her left, still sitting there in the morning light. The chain had been engaged throughout the conversation. Engaged fully, not as a precaution against someone pushing in, but as a deliberate limit on how far the door could open. This was sensible practice for a young woman alone in a house that was not her own. Perfectly sensible. Miss Marple had no quarrel with sensible practice. But the chain was on the inside of the door. And if Miss Hendricks had left this cottage of her own free will, freely and with her own intentions, she had locked the door behind her and gone. She could not also have put the chain on. The chain was an inside thing. Someone inside had put it there after she left, or Miss Hendricks had not left the cottage of her own free will at all, in which case the chain was a different kind of fact. Miss Marple walked back down the brick path, past the roses that needed attention, onto the lane, and continued toward the church. Chapter 4. What the Gardener Saw. Mr. Arthur Atwell had worked in the gardens of 4 Ferngate Crossing properties for 17 years. He had come from somewhere slightly further north, one of those villages that people come from and do not often go back to, or not to stay, and had been absorbed into the village's working life with the practical thoroughness of communities that value competent work above novelty. He was a man of perhaps 70, though the age was difficult to judge with confidence, because he had been weathered to a consistency that suggested he was more or less past the reach of further weathering. He wore, in all seasons, a pale green canvas jacket that had been through enough to have earned retirement but appeared to have no interest in it. He communicated with great efficiency. He used exactly the number of words the situation required, not fewer, because he was not curt or dismissive, and if you asked him a direct question, he answered it with direct care and consideration, but not more. He had no filler. He had no circumlocution. If he had something to say, he said it, and if he did not, he was quiet, and neither state required explanation or apology. Miss Marple found him one of the most restful conversationalists in the village, for the paradoxical reason that conversation with him required the least. She found him on the Saturday afternoon at the compost heap in the grounds of Glebe House, the largest property on the upper lane, whose grounds he also kept. He was turning the heap with his long fork in the focused and unsentimental way that men who understand compost attend to compost heaps. Miss Marple stopped at the fence in the comfortable manner of someone who has nowhere particular to be and has noticed an acquaintance. "Mr. Atwell, you've got a great deal done today. Getting on with it. Frost's coming properly soon." "I'm sure you're right." She watched him for a moment. "I believe you tend Miss Hendricks's garden at Wisteria End every second Thursday?" He paused with the fork. Considered. "Last Thursday as normal." A brief pause. "Didn't see her, though." "She was out?" "She's generally about." "Not in my way. She stays out of the garden while I'm working. Mostly. But she passes through. Goes in and out of the back door. Around 11 she brings out a cup of tea." He returned the fork to the heap in the way of someone punctuating a thought. "No cup Thursday. Back door was locked." "Unusual. The back door is usually accessible?" "Unlocked, yes. Most times. She leaves it so I can put the bin clippings by the step without disturbing her, and in case there's anything wants discussion, she has particular views about how to manage certain things in that garden." Strong views. Something in his expression that in a less economical man would have been a smile. Reasonable ones, as it happens. Miss Marple nodded. "The front of the property," she said, in the tone of someone thinking something through rather than asking directly. "In the past week or so, had anything been different? A car, perhaps, or any disturbance?" Mr. Atwell set the fork against the heap. Gave this question the consideration of someone consulting an actual memory rather than an assumption. "Monday evening," he said. "Coming back from the allotment, around 7 or half past. Car parked in the bay by the side of the cottage. Big dark car. Saloon, not local. How can you be sure it wasn't local?" He looked at her with the calm, undramatic certainty of a man who has spent 17 years on these lanes in every weather and every season. "I know all the local cars. Of course. Was it still there Tuesday morning?" 8 o'clock, yes. Same car, same bay." A pause. "Gone by afternoon when I came back past." "Was there anyone in it on the Monday evening?" He thought about this carefully, which Miss Marple appreciated. Careful memory is more useful than approximate memory, and it is rarer. 2 people in the front seats. Engine off. Just sitting. Not getting out. Not when I passed. I didn't stop." He looked at her steadily. "Miss Hendricks all right, is she?" "I expect so," said Miss Marple. "She seems to have gone away on a family matter." Said Mr. Atwell. This syllable, in his usage, covered a considerable range of evaluative terrain. He returned to his compost heap. Miss Marple returned to the lane and walked slowly toward the green, carrying with her the specific and detailed image of 2 people sitting in a large, dark car outside a cottage on a Monday evening with the engine off. not tourists looking at a map, not delivery drivers consulting paperwork. Two people who had come to this place with a particular intention and were waiting, patient, unhurried, to carry it out. Chapter 5. Lavinia and the Power of Comfortable Chairs. Lavinia Partridge was a woman who had been making people feel welcome for 68 years and had grown very skilled at it. Her house had the quality that the best houses have, which is not tidiness or decoration or the correct furniture in the correct rooms, but the quality of having been lived in with genuine pleasure by someone who liked being at home. The chairs had developed over the years a warm and sympathetic relationship with their regular occupants. Miss Marple's chair in particular had taken what one could only describe as a personal interest in her comfort, having accommodated itself to her dimensions and habits in a way that made sitting elsewhere a slightly inferior experience. The kitchen produced good things at regular intervals without apparent effort on Lavinia's part. The fires were always lit before you thought to ask about them. Lavinia herself was enthusiastic, warm, and observant in the way of a camera that has not quite settled on its focal point. She noticed a great many things and drew conclusions from them with genuine energy and only partial accuracy, and she would have been the first to admit this, had she been aware of it, which she largely wasn't. She cared about people. She paid attention to them. She simply occasionally missed the step between observation and understanding, which meant that she often knew a great deal without quite knowing what she knew. That Saturday evening, she and Miss Marple sat on either side of the fire after supper, and the fire gave off the comfortable, crackling warmth of applewood, which was the only wood Lavinia burned in the sitting-room fireplace because she said it smelled like an orchard, and she liked the association, and she and Miss Marple had been through half a pot of tea already, in the pleasant meandering way of an evening that has nowhere it needs to arrive. Lavinia knitted something in sage green whose nature had not yet declared itself. It had the ambiguous, hopeful quality of early-stage knitting, which could still become several different things, and Miss Marple drank her tea and listened to the comfortable rhythm of village gossip in the way that she always listened to it, not lazily, but with the patient attention of someone mining for something specific in material that appears general. "What do you know about Miss Hendricks at Wisteria End, Lavinia?" she said when a natural pause in the conversation offered itself. Lavinia put down her needles. This was always a good sign. It meant the subject was going to receive full consideration. Dorothy Hendricks. Well, now. She's settled back. She's been here 12 years, which you probably know. She came after she retired from teaching in Bristol. Geography, I believe, or possibly history. She teaches at secondary level, one of those subjects that involves maps and dates and the kind of organized thinking that some people are built for and some people genuinely aren't. She smiled. She paints watercolors. Quite seriously, actually, she won something at a county show several years ago, I believe, though she doesn't mention it. She does the church flowers in spring and summer and drops off in autumn, which is her right. She's in the gardening club, but doesn't say very much at meetings. She came to 2 of my dinner parties in the first few years she was here, and then declined subsequent invitations, which I took as a preference for quieter evenings rather than any reflection on my cooking. She had a sister, said Miss Marple. Yes. Marion. Married name Boswell. Her husband is in property development of some kind. Quite successful, by all accounts, somewhere in the Exeter area. They haven't spoken in years. Since their mother died, roughly, there was some trouble over the estate, over what was left to whom. Dorothy had apparently expected the family house to come to her, and it went to Marion instead, and the money was also unequal. I don't know the exact details because nobody does, or if they do, they have exercised remarkable discretion. But the impression I always had was that Dorothy felt she had been treated unfairly, and that Marion had perhaps, well, that Marion had not argued on her sister's behalf with any great vigor. When did you last see Miss Hendricks? This past week or so? Lavinia thought about this. A week ago Monday, she said slowly. In the lane behind the post office. She was coming back from somewhere, moving fairly quickly. I called hello and told her about the Henderson boy getting into university, lovely news, such a deserving family, and she barely responded. Said something brief and moved on. She frowned, which is unlike her. She's interested in village news. Not nosily, she's not that kind, but genuinely. She likes knowing how people are getting on. Was she troubled, do you think, or simply preoccupied? I've been thinking about that. Lavinia put her knitting down entirely now, which meant she was being very serious. Troubled. I think troubled. She looked over her shoulder twice while I was talking to her. I noticed it, but I told myself it was just the wind coming round that corner, because there's always a gust there. But it wasn't the wind, was it? She was watching behind herself, checking whether someone was behind her in the lane, and was someone behind her in the lane? There was. A man. 40 or 50 yards up, standing. I didn't notice him at the time as anything significant. He was just a man who had stopped walking, which people do. Medium height. Dark coat. Nothing distinctive about him that I can now recall, which is itself interesting, isn't it? People you can't describe are sometimes the most deliberately undescribable. Yes, said Miss Marple quietly. They often are. The fire settled, and the knitting resumed, and the October dark pressed its comfortable weight against the windows. Lavinia asked about Raymond and Clara and whether Miss Marple thought the Hendersons' garden had improved since they'd redone the front, and the conversation moved on to other things. But Miss Marple carried with her, into the quieter part of the evening, the image of a woman turning to look behind her in a lane, and a man who had stopped walking and was simply standing. Chapter 6. The vicar's wife remembers something useful. Constance Thurlow had lived in Ferngate Crossing for 27 years, and in that time she had accumulated a social memory that was, in Miss Marple's experience, exceptional even by the standards of women who are both intelligent and long. Resident in the same village. It was not gossip, and it was not nosiness. It was something closer to the work of a careful historian, the systematic retention of information about human lives and their connections, kept not for personal advantage, but because she genuinely cared about the people whose lives intersected with hers and found them endlessly interesting and worthy of attention. She was 60, tall, with good gray eyes and the excellent posture of someone who has spent decades standing in the front of a church beside a man who deals, by necessity, in presents. She ran the church's various social and community undertakings with the combination of warmth and firm competence of someone who knows exactly how things should be done and has the quiet confidence to do them that way without requiring credit for it. She was also, when she chose to be, a very useful person to talk to. Miss Marple found her in the church porch on Sunday morning, engaged in the annual and somewhat futile negotiation with the remnants of the Harvest Festival display. The Marrows, in particular, had reached a state of advanced philosophical assertion. They were dominating the arrangement with the confidence of vegetables that know they are no longer decorative, but have nowhere else to be. Those Marrows are becoming rather insistent, said Miss Marple. They always do, said Constance, with the resigned affection of a woman who has had this specific annual conversation with this specific genus of vegetable for 20 years. A marrow is not a display vegetable, Miss Marple. A marrow is a statement of intent. After a certain point, the intent becomes somewhat bleak. They went into the church together, out of the cold, and into the particular warmth of a church that has been heated for a Sunday morning service. Not the warmth of a centrally heated room, which is even and reliable and slightly dull, but the warmth of a large stone building with radiators that have been on since 6 in the morning, working against 600 years of absorbed cold, which is a warmth that is uneven and slightly eccentric and has character. The church smelled of stone and wood polish and old hymn books and the faint, lingering ghost of last Sunday's flowers. They settled into their customary pews in the gentle pre-service murmur of the early congregation, that particular sound that belongs to old churches on cold Sunday mornings. Part greeting, part the rustling of coats and prayer books, part the deep and patient warmth of a building that has been receiving people for centuries and has become itself a form of welcome. I wonder, said Miss Marple very quietly, in the cover of this murmur, whether you happen to know much about Miss Hendricks's family background. You've been here considerably longer than I have. I know she has a sister. Constance Thurlow's social memory engaged with the precise and visible efficiency of a well-maintained mechanism. Miss Marple could almost see the internal indexing happen, the slight settling of the face, the brief inward look, the retrieval and cross-referencing of data accumulated over years of attentive community life. Marion, she said, quietly and carefully. Married name Boswell. Her husband, Philip Boswell, is in property development, the West Country primarily, and, by all accounts, does extremely well. They live in Exeter, or in the Exeter area. She and Dorothy have not spoken, to my knowledge, in at least 8 years. Perhaps longer. The falling out was over their mother's estate? Over the house, primarily. Their mother died. She was in her late 80s, a widow. Her husband had been dead for many years. There was a house, the family house in Exeter, where both girls grew up, and there was some money. Dorothy had understood, had been given to understand, though in the way that unstated assumptions sometimes constitute being given to understand, that the house would come to her. She had been closer to their mother in the later years. She had visited more frequently. She had helped manage various arrangements. She had, in some sense, earned a certain expectation, and the house went to Marion. Along with the majority of the estate, Dorothy received a sum, not nothing, but considerably less than she had expected, and with no share in the house. Constance's voice was even and non-judgmental, as it generally was when she described human failings. What made it particularly difficult, I always thought, was that Marion didn't need it. Her husband was prosperous. They were already more comfortable than Dorothy had ever been, or was likely to be. The financial inequality was not about need on either side. It was about something else, some old account between them that I don't think anyone outside the family ever fully understood. And Dorothy has never spoken of it here? To you? Or to anyone? Not to me. Not directly. I know what I know from the small things she has said over the years, pieced together, the way she speaks of her childhood, the way she never mentions visiting Exeter, the way she deflects when families are discussed. She is a proud woman and a private one. She carries things quietly. That's both her strength and, at times, her difficulty. The organ began its opening murmurings, that tentative, private phase of an organ warming itself that Miss Marple had always found rather beautiful, before it arrives at its full purpose. The congregation settled. Constance looked at her steadily. "You're concerned about her," she said. "I am," said Miss Marple simply. "She's been away since early in the week, and a young woman is staying at the cottage. The young woman says Miss Hendricks has gone to visit family in Exeter. But I find that rather difficult to believe given everything you've told me." "So do I," said Constance, and opened her prayer book. "Dorothy has no family in Exeter that would welcome a visit. The only family she has there is Marion." She said nothing more, but Miss Marple noticed, as they rose for the first hymn, that Constance held her prayer book with both hands and that her knuckles were slightly tighter than they needed to be. Chapter 7. A Letter with No Return Address. On Sunday afternoon, Miss Marple wrote a letter to her nephew Raymond's wife, Clara. Clara was a solicitor, had been for 15 years, and a good one, with the kind of sharp but patient intelligence that the law rewards when combined with genuine application. Earlier in the year, she had joined a firm in Cirencester, which put her within the professional geography of the Gloucester-Cheltenham-Cotswold legal world, and also within a reasonable circle of professional acquaintance that reached, if not to Exeter directly, then to people who knew the Exeter legal world reasonably well. Miss Marple was fond of Clara, genuinely, not merely usefully, and she was careful to begin the letter with 3 full paragraphs of genuine personal interest, how Clara was finding the new firm, whether the adjustment had been as difficult as she had anticipated, how Raymond was managing with the drive, whether they had found a good restaurant in Cirencester, because Raymond had mentioned the situation was improving. In the fourth paragraph, she mentioned a theoretical question about property law that had been occupying her mind, specifically the matter of conflicting wills and the legal status of a later will discovered after an earlier will had been fully probated. She framed it as intellectual curiosity rather than a pressing matter. She said she simply wanted to understand the general principles, as she found the law interesting and Clara was such a good person to ask. And then, in the final paragraph, she mentioned in a brief and casual way that she had come across a reference, in some local context she didn't precisely specify, to a property firm or solicitor in the Exeter area with the name Boswell. She wasn't sure whether it was the individual or the firm name, and she wondered, if it wasn't too much trouble, whether Clara had ever heard of them. She wasn't sure she'd ever need to recommend an Exeter solicitor to anyone, but it was useful to know who one might suggest. She read the letter through once before sealing it, which was her habit, not to correct it, which she rarely needed to do, but to hear it, and make sure it said what she intended and nothing more. It did. She sealed the envelope and addressed it in her careful, small handwriting and posted it Monday morning, arriving at the post office before Mrs. Lorne had properly opened and slipping it through the letterbox while the jackdaws were still conducting the first territorial negotiations of the morning on the green. On Monday afternoon, walking back past Wisteria End, she noticed two things. The teacup had been removed from the outside windowsill, which was a change of some kind, and the kitchen window on the side of the cottage was open approximately 2 inches at the bottom. Not an invitation. Not the kind of opening that says come in. The kind of opening that says the air in here has been insufficient and I need a small amount more. Someone who had been in the cottage long enough to want that. On Tuesday morning, she encountered Dr. Alice Prentice on the high street outside the pharmacy. Dr. Prentice was 46, practical in hair and dress and manner, running slightly behind schedule as she was always running slightly behind schedule. Because a conscientious GP in a village practice is chronically behind schedule and has accepted this as a permanent condition of her professional life, like the weather. She was reading her telephone as she came out of the pharmacy, fair enough, given her time constraints, and she looked up when Miss Marple said good morning. "I hope you don't mind my asking," said Miss Marple, in the tone of someone who will entirely understand if the answer is yes. "Have you seen Miss Hendricks recently? From Wisteria End? I've been a little concerned. She seems to have been away since early last week, and she didn't mention it to any of her neighbors before she left." Dr. Prentice stopped walking. The phone went into her coat pocket. She looked at Miss Marple with an expression that contained several things: professional constraint, personal concern, and something in the territory between them that was doing most of the work. "I'm not able to discuss patients," she said. This was stated as a simple fact, without apology or defensiveness. It was a boundary, and she maintained it. "Of course not," said Miss Marple. "But," said the doctor, after a brief pause, a considered pause, the pause of someone who has something to say and is working out the form in which it can be said without crossing a line she means to hold, "if you have genuine concerns about someone's welfare, I would say that speaking with the local police is entirely appropriate. They have a routine procedure for welfare checks. It's nothing dramatic. It simply establishes whether someone is where they're supposed to be and in good health." She held Miss Marple's gaze for one moment. Then she said good morning and went to her next patient. The doctor had not confirmed that anything was wrong. She had maintained her professional obligations precisely and correctly throughout. But she had also said, "Call the police." Not "don't worry," not "she's perfectly fine," not "I'm sure there's a simple explanation." She had said, "Call the police." Which was, when you stripped away the careful wrapping, an answer to the question Miss Marple had been carrying since Saturday. Chapter 8. Sergeant Doyle and the Limits of Routine. Sergeant Noel Doyle had been at the Ferngate Crossing station for 6 years, and before that at a station in a market town to the north, and before that for 5 years in the city. He was 44, and solidly built in a way that suggested steadiness rather than size. He was not a large man, but he had the quality of permanent groundedness that some people have, a sense of being unlikely to be moved without his consent. He had a square, honest, pleasant face, and the manner of someone who has dealt with most variations of human situation without becoming either cynical or naive about them, which is a difficult balance to maintain, and which he managed with evident effort and good faith. He dealt with Miss Marple with the careful, patient attention that he applied to all members of the public who came to him with concerns, and with an additional quality of attentiveness that the community support officer had apparently communicated to him. She had described Miss Marple as the old lady at Partridge's cottage who sometimes knows things, which was reductive but not entirely inaccurate, and Sergeant Doyle had filed it as information. She laid out her concerns in the order that seemed most useful: the teacup on the outside windowsill for 4 days, the curtains shut since the beginning of the week, the young woman who had described herself only as a friend and given no other identification, the chain on the inside of the door. During a daytime visit, the pension not collected on Thursday, the village doctor's response when asked about Miss Hendricks's welfare, and the large, dark, non-local car parked outside the cottage on Monday evening and Tuesday morning, with 2 people in the front seats on the Monday. Engine off. She did not editorialize. She did not suggest conclusions. She presented the facts in their order and left them there, the way you place objects on a table for someone else to examine, trusting that the arrangement will speak for itself. Sergeant Doyle wrote all of this down. He asked clear, sensible questions. How long had she been in the village? How well she knew Miss Hendricks? Whether anyone else had formally reported anything? Whether she had any specific reason, beyond what she'd described, to believe something was wrong rather than simply unexplained? No single specific reason, said Miss Marple honestly. A number of small things. Small things individually insignificant, but together they add up to a pattern that doesn't fit the person I've observed over 7 months. People who keep their gardens like Miss Hendricks don't stop keeping them suddenly, without reason. People who collect their pension every Thursday without exception don't miss it without reason. People who are private but perfectly civil don't put their front door on the chain in the middle of the morning without reason. He said he would look into it, in the way that he would actually look into it, and she recognized the difference. He went to Wisteria End that afternoon. The young woman answered, without the chain, this time, which was interesting in itself. She told him that Miss Hendricks had gone to visit her sister in Exeter. The sister's name was Boswell. The visit had been planned. She expected Miss Hendricks back by the weekend. She was calm and cooperative and told him everything he asked and nothing he hadn't. He checked. He rang the Devon and Cornwall police, who ran a brief check on the Boswell address in Exeter. No Dorothy Hendricks registered there. He checked the local hospitals. No Dorothy Hendricks admitted in the past 10 days. No record of her anywhere in the Exeter area in the past week. He came to Lavinia's cottage on Wednesday morning. He was slightly pale about the eyes, the specific pallor of a night spent working through conclusions that have been uncomfortable. She didn't go to Exeter, he said. Not to her sister's. Not to any hospital. There's no trace of her in the area. No, said Miss Marple. I thought not. I'm going back to the cottage this morning with a colleague. He paused, navigating something. I wonder. I know this is an unusual request, but sometimes in situations like this, an unofficial presence can be. That is, people sometimes respond differently to. An elderly woman with no authority who appears to simply be concerned, said Miss Marple. Yes. I'm happy to come. She put on her warmest coat and her best walking shoes and followed him out into the cold, clear Wednesday morning that had since Saturday become quietly and irrevocably a different kind of morning. Chapter 9. The young woman's real name. Her name was Karen Pelham. She was 29 and from Bristol, and she had been, 12 years ago, a pupil in the geography class of a Miss Dorothy Hendricks at a secondary school in the Redland area of the city. These facts emerged not at once, but in stages, through the first story, which was implausible, through the second, which was internally contradictory, through the deliberate and significant silence that followed, during which Sergeant Doyle waited with the quiet, unhurried patience of a good policeman who understands that silence does not require filling, and then, finally, through the account that Karen Pelham gave when she had decided, with the mixture of exhaustion and relief that comes at the end of a sustained and untenable position, to tell the truth. She spoke quietly and steadily, without self-pity and without drama, and Miss Marple listened to her the way she listened to most things, with complete and uncritical attention, letting the words settle without rushing to arrange them. "She was kind to me when I was 16, Karen Pelham said. She said it the way people state a fact that has been important for a long time, not emotionally, or not primarily, but with the particular gravity of something that has mattered in the real, consequential sense of the word. I was a difficult girl. I knew it. I was prickly and sullen, and I worked hard at making myself unpleasant because it was easier than being vulnerable to people who might not be kind back. Miss Hendricks, she didn't respond to any of that. She just looked straight through it, to whatever was actually happening, and she asked me questions that assumed I had something worth saying. Nobody else was doing that." A pause. I remembered it. I've always remembered it. They were in the sitting room of Wisteria End. Sergeant Doyle and Constable Reese had taken the chairs on the far side of the small table, and Karen Pelham sat in the armchair by the fireplace. Miss Hendricks's own armchair, almost certainly. Judging by its angle and relationship to the lamp and the small side table with its stack of books, one of which had a bookmark placed approximately 3/4 through, as though someone had put it down in the middle of a chapter with every intention of returning. The fire had not been lit this morning. The room was cold in the way of rooms whose fires have been neglected for a few days, but the room itself spoke very clearly of its inhabitant. 11 watercolors on the walls, small and precise and deeply felt. A bookcase whose shelves were organized with the specific logic of a person who uses their books and knows exactly where each one is. A low window seat with a pot of African violets in what was currently a state of mild neglect but clearly habitual care. The smell of the room was the particular combination of linseed oil and old paper and dry autumn air that belongs to a place where one thoughtful person has lived for a long time. "When did you arrive?" Sergeant Doyle asked. "Sunday night. Late, around 11:30. I let myself in with my key. She gave me a key a few years ago because I sometimes pass through this part of the country for work, and she said I was always welcome to stay in the spare room. I came in through the back. She was looking at her hands, which were folded in her lap with the deliberate stillness of someone managing something. She was here. She was in the sitting room with 2 people I didn't know. I heard voices as I came in. I stayed in the kitchen because the conversation didn't sound like something I should walk into." 2 people, said Miss Marple quietly. "I couldn't see them from the kitchen. I heard a man's voice mostly, controlled, low, quite insistent, and a woman's voice occasionally. They were in the sitting room. I stayed very still for a long time." "How long were they there?" "They left close to midnight. I heard the front door. Heard the car start up. I waited a few minutes and then I went through. She was quiet for a moment. She was very frightened. She tried not to show me, but I know what frightened looks like on her. I've known her a long time now. She sat down and she said, 'Karen, I need your help.' She said she needed to go away for a few days and she needed me to stay here, and if anyone asked to say she'd gone to visit family. She said the less I knew the better. She didn't tell you where she was going?" "No. She said knowing less would be better for me, and she meant it. She wasn't being mysterious, she was being protective." Karen Pelham looked at Sergeant Doyle directly. She was frightened, and she thought quickly, and she asked me for a specific kind of help. I gave it to her because I owed her something I can't repay by any other means. Did she say anything else? Before she left, Karen Pelham was quiet for long enough that Miss Marple thought she might not answer. Then she said one thing. She was at the door, very early Monday morning before it was properly light, with her bag, and she said, "If it goes wrong, if anyone needs to understand what this is about, the answer is in the paintings." She looked at the walls. They all looked at the walls. 11 watercolors, hanging in the quiet gray morning light of Wisteria End's sitting room. Small, precise, careful, deeply observed. A village, a church, a mill pond, fields and lanes and cottage gardens and all the beautiful patient accumulation of a place seen clearly over many years. And at the end of the row, hung at a small interval that created a pause, as though the painter herself had understood that this painting needed a breath of space before it. A painting that was different from the others in its subject, though not in its quality or its care. Miss Marple looked at the paintings slowly, one by one, from left to right, giving each one its proper attention. And when she came to the last one, she stood in front of it for a long time. Chapter 10. What the Watercolors Knew. Miss Marple stood before the last painting in the row and let her eyes move across it with the patience and precision of someone reading something important in a language they know well, but are taking care not to mistake. It was a house, not a Ferngate Crossing house, not a Cotswold house, not the kind of modest or comfortable property that a retired schoolteacher might have within her circle of daily acquaintance. It was a larger property, Georgian in its bones, with the regular symmetry of that period, the measured spacing of sash windows, the plain classical dignity of a facade that had been built to suggest solidity and permanence without ostentation. The render on the exterior was cream, not the bright, maintained white of a house recently attended to, but the warmer, weathered cream of a building that has been standing for a long time and wearing its age with quiet confidence. A gravel drive appeared at the left side of the composition, a brick boundary wall with a wrought iron gate at the front. The painting was a twilight study. The sky behind the house was the deep gray blue of an October evening just after the light is gone. The particular color of that specific transition, when the day has ended but the night hasn't quite settled, and everything is outlined and slightly suspended. The windows of the house were lit, most of them with the warm amber of occupied rooms, human life conducting its evening routines behind glass. One window on the upper floor was different, third from the left, second floor. The light in it was slightly brighter than the others, or differently bright, less warm, more particular, as though something specific was happening near it, rather than just the general ambience of a room in use. In that window there was a figure. You had to look for it. You had to stand at the right distance and let your eyes find the scale of the painting, because it was painted very small, intentionally small, Miss Marple thought, painted with the deliberate restraint of someone who knows what she is doing and has decided how much to show and how much to leave. A suggestion of a human figure, upright, close to the glass, facing outward, and holding something up, something flat and rectangular, held at arm's length, angled toward the glass, toward the outside, toward the viewer standing below in the imaginary gravel drive of the painting. The size and proportions of a document, of a piece of paper, of something that was being displayed rather than merely held. Miss Marple looked at the figure for a long time. Behind the figure, in the room, there was a piece of furniture, dark, rectangular, against the back wall. A bureau, the proportions of a Regency bureau, with the specific architecture of that period's writing furniture, the slanted fall front, the legs beneath, the fitted interior that you could see, was fitted even in this small and shadowed background detail because Miss Hendricks had painted it with the knowledge of someone who had opened and closed that bureau many times. "This painting," said Miss Marple, "is not like the others. The subject is different," said Sergeant Doyle. "The others are all local." "Yes. But that's not only what I mean. The others are painted by someone who lives here and loves what she sees around her. This one is painted by someone who is painting from memory, or from grief, or from both." She turned to Karen Pelham. This is her family home, I think. Karen Pelham was standing close to the painting now. She mentioned a house, she said softly. She talked about it sometimes, not often. A large house in Exeter, she grew up there. She said it was beautiful and it was cold, and she wasn't sure she'd ever properly felt it was home, but she'd loved it anyway, the way you love the places that made you. A pause. She said it belonged to her sister now. She painted the bureau, said Miss Marple. That piece of furniture in the background of the room behind the figure. She painted it very precisely, very correctly. Look at the proportions, the fitted interior visible in the shadow. She knows that bureau. She looked at it for another moment. And the figure holding something up toward the glass, she stopped. She looked at the figure, the document, the window, the twilight, the bureau behind it all. She posted a parcel to an Exeter address, said Miss Marple quietly. The Monday before, a large parcel. More postage than she expected. She turned from the painting. She posted a document to her sister's house, to the bureau that belongs to her family. She sent it there because she thought it would be safe there, because her sister would not recognize what it was, would not look for it. And then she followed it, because she needed to know it was there. Sergeant Doyle was looking at her. What document? I don't know exactly, said Miss Marple, but I think if we were to ask it to name itself, it would name itself something to do with a will. A document that changes what belongs to whom. A document that two people came on a Sunday night in a large, dark car to a cottage in the Cotswolds to obtain or to prevent. Constable Rees looked at the painting. Karen Pelham looked at it. She hid the answer in the painting, said Karen. She actually hid it. In a painting she'd been making for years. She didn't hide it, said Miss Marple, correcting gently. She preserved it. There is a difference. She painted the truth as she knew it, carefully and precisely, as she always painted everything. And she trusted that someone would look closely enough to see. She turned from the painting. I think it would be worth going to Exeter. Chapter 11. The Boswell House. By Wednesday evening, Sergeant Doyle had involved Rosalind Marsh of the county CID, because that was the appropriate escalation, and because Sergeant Doyle was, before all things, a man who understood when a situation had moved beyond the geography of his own station, and who made that judgment without ego or reluctance. Marsh was 41, with short auburn hair and the brisk, intelligent manner of someone who is accustomed to moving quickly through complex situations without losing either precision or the wider view. She had been told about Miss Marple in a brief telephone conversation with Sergeant Doyle, in terms that were carefully neutral and which nevertheless communicated something of how much weight he was placing on Miss Marple's observations. Marsh arrived at Lavinia's cottage on the Wednesday evening, spoke to Miss Marple for 30 minutes, and said she was happy for her to come to Exeter in an unofficial consultative capacity. They drove to Exeter on Thursday morning. The Cotswold Hills gave way gradually to flatter country as they went west and south, the stone walls becoming less frequent and then absent, the soil reddening, the hedgerows changing their character in the way that hedgerows change when you move between landscapes, the same basic form, but different personality, as though the hedges understand which county they are in. Miss Marple sat in the passenger seat and looked at the country with the quiet attention she gave to most things, and thought about what she was going to find when they arrived, and what she hoped to find, and what she was prepared to find if the two were not the same. The Boswell house was in the northern part of the city, on a road lined with mature trees and substantial properties, where the houses were set back from the pavement behind gardens and walls, and the general atmosphere was of money that had been here long enough to have become comfortable with. Itself. The house was precisely as Miss Hendricks had painted it, the Georgian facade, the cream render, the sash windows, the gravel drive. Someone had repainted the render more recently than the painting, and the windows had been replaced with double-glazed units of the correct proportions, but the house was immediately recognizable as the same building. It was very large. It was very well maintained. It was, standing before it in the cold October morning, a house that communicated the complete absence of any financial urgency about it. Marion Boswell was 54 and dressed with the specific combination of quality and understatement that communicates prosperity to people who understand these things and nothing to people who don't, which is itself a form of social sorting. She had her sister's coloring, the same gray-brown hair, the same angular jaw, but the resemblance was of the kind that shows the same basic material used differently, in the way that the same clay makes different vessels depending on the hands that shape it. Her gray eyes were intelligent and watchful and were currently performing a social function of careful and managed graciousness that sat over something considerably less relaxed. She received them in the front sitting room. It was a beautiful room. High ceilings, tall windows, good furniture, the accumulated objects of a house that had been properly curated over time. It was also, in the particular way of some beautiful rooms, slightly cold. Not in temperature, in the quality of habitation. It was a room that was always ready to receive visitors, and was therefore not quite fully itself between visits. The bureau stood in the corner. Dark and quiet and very fine, rosewood and satinwood inlay, Regency period, the fall front closed, the whole thing projecting the solid, patient authority of an object that has been in one family for 200 years and is aware of its own history. Miss Marple took the chair by the window. She said very little while Marsh and Marion Boswell conducted the opening exchange, which followed the form of these things, polite questions, politely answered, the whole surface of it correct and cordial and containing within itself the structure of two people who are playing a game both. Understand, I have no idea where Dorothy is, Marion Boswell said. We haven't been in contact for years. This is well established, I'm sure you've been told. The situation with our mother's estate was handled perfectly legally, perfectly properly, by a reputable firm. If Dorothy has ever suggested otherwise, she has perhaps not presented it accurately. We're simply trying to establish her whereabouts, said Marsh evenly. When did you last have any contact with her? Years. I can't give you a precise date. You didn't visit her last Sunday evening? The arranged surface of Marion Boswell's expression moved, fractionally, not in any way that would have been visible to someone who had not been watching for exactly that. It rearranged itself in a small and very rapid self-correction, and then it was back, and she said, "No, that is your mother's bureau," said Miss Marple pleasantly, from the chair by the window. Marion Boswell turned to look at her. It was the first time she had properly acknowledged Miss Marple's presence. She had been conducting the conversation exclusively with Marsh, which was natural enough given their respective official statuses, and Miss Marple had not minded. "Yes," said Marion Boswell, "my mother's bureau. She left it to me with the house. It's a lovely piece," said Miss Marple, in the warm, appreciative tone of someone who has a genuine interest in furniture, and this is simply furniture. Regency, I'd say. The inlay is rosewood and satinwood. You can see the color difference in the cross banding on the front panel. Your mother had an excellent eye. She looked at it with comfortable admiration. Your sister painted it, I believe. I recognize the particular way she handles inlaid wood. She has a very distinctive approach to reflected light on polished surfaces. I've been looking at her work rather carefully this morning, as it happens. Marion Boswell was now looking at Miss Marple with full and not particularly comfortable attention, the attention of someone who has realized that a conversation they thought they had entirely under control has been, from another direction, entirely, also under control. I wonder, said Miss Marple, with the gentle, innocent curiosity of someone wondering whether one might have another biscuit, what is inside it. The room was very quiet. From upstairs, just audible, or almost not audible, or perhaps audible only to people who had been listening for it, there was the small ambient sound of a house that has more than one person in it. The particular living quiet of a room where someone is present and holding very still. Chapter 12. The document in the bureau. Dorothy Hendricks was upstairs, in the back bedroom, which was the room that had been her room as a child and as a young woman, which still had the window that looked out over the garden she had grown up looking out over. and which her sister had refurnished with the specific thoroughness of someone redecorating a room they wanted to feel was entirely theirs. She had been there since Monday morning. She had arrived in the early dark, before the house was properly awake, having been driven, or having driven herself. The details were clarified later, through the night, on the conviction that the document she had posted was here, in the bureau, and that she needed to know it was still there and had not been found and destroyed. It took approximately 20 minutes for Marion Boswell's composed account of things to begin its orderly collapse. The first stage was a firmer reiteration of the original position, delivered with slightly too much emphasis, the emphasis of someone who is no longer defending a position from confidence, but from momentum. The second stage was a partial concession. Yes, Dorothy had contacted her recently. There had been some correspondence about a family matter. She hadn't thought it was relevant. The third stage, which came with the particular exhausted relief of someone who has been carrying something heavy for too long, was the full account. Their mother had made 2 wills. The first will, dated approximately 8 months before her death, left the house and the larger portion of the estate to Marion, with a more modest sum to Dorothy. This was the will that had been found immediately, presented to the solicitor, and probated in the ordinary way. This was the will that had defined the shape of Dorothy's grief and sense of injustice for 8 years. The second will had been made 4 months and 11 days after the first. It was in their mother's handwriting, on the stationery she always used, witnessed by 2 people whose names were legible and traceable. It left the house to Dorothy and divided the estate equally between both daughters. It was dated later than the first will. On its face, it was entirely legal, and it superseded the first will entirely. Dorothy had found it approximately a year after the first, when a box of her mother's personal papers was sent to her by mistake from the solicitor's office. A miscategorization, a misfiled box, the kind of administrative error that happens in any busy office dealing with the accumulated paperwork of a long life. Inside the box, among letters and household accounts and the small accumulated documentation of decades, was this document. She had taken it to a solicitor of her own. He had told her, carefully and without false promises, that she appeared to have a strong case, that the later will appeared valid on its face, but that contesting a probated will was expensive and time-consuming and would require examination of the witnesses and various other processes and could not be guaranteed to succeed regardless of the apparent validity of the document. She had been thinking about this for months, going back to it in the evenings, turning it over, considering the cost and the length of it, and the uncertainty of the outcome, and wondering whether 8 years of quiet grief was not in some sense preferable to however many more years of legal process and the forced re-examination of everything that had been painful to begin with. She was not a person who made decisions recklessly. She was a person who thought things through to their proper conclusions, which is sometimes a considerable disadvantage when the thing being thought about is something you are not sure you want to conclude. She had been thinking about this for months when Marion's message arrived, conciliatory, suggesting that after so many years a conversation might help, that there might be room for some resolution between them. She came Sunday night, Dorothy said. She was sitting at the kitchen table of the Boswell house, wearing a borrowed cardigan, both hands around a mug of tea that had gone lukewarm while she held it, but which she was holding anyway. She looked deeply tired. Not the tiredness of a few poor nights, but the accumulated tiredness of several days in which fear had been the constant background. Marion and Philip. They arrived around 8. They had clearly known about the second will for some time. Philip said something that suggested they'd been in contact with someone at the solicitor's office I'd consulted. I don't know how or who, but they knew. What did they want? Asked DeMarsh. They wanted the document. They said it was forged. They said their mother had been confused in the period she made it. She was very elderly, and there were things about her mental state at that stage of her life that could be characterized various ways, and Philip, who is a businessman and who thinks in those terms, was describing how they might be characterized. They weren't threatening me. Not in words. She looked at the table. But there was a quality to the conversation that made very clear what was expected of me and what the consequences would be if I didn't cooperate. "You were frightened," said Demarche. "Yes." I was very frightened. I sent the document here before they arrived. I posted it on Monday, the Monday before, to this address. No return address on the parcel. Just a book, inside, wrapped in brown paper, with the document inside the book. I thought if Marian received a parcel addressed to herself from an unknown sender, she would open it and she wouldn't know what she was looking at. It would just be a parcel she'd received. And it would be here, and safe, and I would have time to think. And then you followed it, said Miss Marple quietly. I followed it Monday morning, before light. I left Karen asleep. I drove through the night. She looked at the table. Because I needed to know it was here, and because, if they were going to destroy it, I wanted to be here when they did. I needed to know. "Why didn't you go to the police?" asked Sergeant Doyle. Dorothy Hendricks was quiet for a moment. Because what would I have said? That my sister visited me and had an unpleasant conversation about a will that I hadn't yet acted on legally? That I was frightened? There are no words in what they said that would make a case. Nothing that could be pointed to. She paused. And because I've been carrying this alone for a long time, and I am in the habit of dealing with things alone, it is, I think, one of my less useful habits. Demarche turned to Marian Boswell, who was standing in the kitchen doorway with her hands very still and her face set in the composed, still arrangement of someone who has decided that dignity is the only thing left to preserve and intends to preserve it. "The bureau," Demarche said. "I'd like to have it open, please." Chapter 13. The afternoon the light changed. It was there, inside the bureau, in the second of the 3 small drawers on the left-hand side of the fitted interior, the drawer that had always, in the family's usage, been used for personal correspondence, Dorothy said later, and that Marian would therefore not have opened first, because Marian opened. Things in order, and the correspondence drawer was not the order. There was a book, a small hardback atlas, somewhat aged, with a cloth cover softened at the corners by years of handling. And inside the atlas, between the pages showing the Greater Exeter area, was a folded document in Mrs. Hendricks's handwriting, witnessed in 2 different hands, dated 4 months and 11 days after the first will. Demarche dealt with it as Demarche dealt with everything, with the thorough, unhurried precision of someone who understands that everything done in the next hour matters enormously for everything that follows. The document was logged and bagged. Photographs were taken. Statements were requested. Solicitors were contacted. The process of the law, once set in motion, moved with its particular combination of inevitability and slowness, and it would continue to move for some months and possibly years before it arrived at any final destination. Philip Boswell, who emerged from the study at the far end of the house with the air of a man who had been listening to everything and was now calculating what the best position going forward might be, was also interviewed. He was 60, solidly built, with a particular kind of confidence that comes from decades of making decisions about money and having them generally come out correctly. He cooperated with the interview with the precise, guarded politeness of someone who has a solicitor already in mind and knows that what he says now will matter later. The question of whether what had occurred on Sunday evening at Wisteria End constituted a criminal matter was, Demarche explained carefully to Dorothy, a matter for the Crown Prosecution Service to evaluate in due course. It depended on the content of the statements and the legal advice that followed. Dorothy Hendricks wished to go home. Miss Marple sat beside her in the back of the police car on the return journey through the Cotswold Hills. The business of the day had taken longer than these things ever seemed like they should take, and it was late afternoon now, moving into the low golden hour that October afternoons in this part of the country produce when the conditions are right. The light was coming in at a long angle across the hills, amber and specific, finding the texture of every stone wall and every field and every lane, making the ordinary landscape briefly extraordinary in the way that October light does before it disappears, and leaves only the dark. They were quiet for most of the journey. The hills went by. The hamlets appeared and dissolved into the October distance. Miss Marple watched it all and thought about nothing in particular and everything at once, in the way that she thought when she was allowing conclusions to settle rather than forcing them. "How did you know it was that specific painting?" said Dorothy Hendricks after a long interval. "Not just the paintings in general." "The figure in the window," said Miss Marple, holding something up toward the glass, painted very small, very quietly. If you didn't stand close and look carefully, you might not notice it at all. But it was there, and it was deliberate. You painted it with care. And the bureau in the room behind the figure, I recognized it when I stood in front of your mother's bureau and had seen it properly. The proportions, the inlay, the fitted interior. You had painted it accurately. Dorothy Hendricks looked out of the window at the passing hills. "I've painted that house," she said, "since I left it. I paint it every few years. Different light, different season, different time of day. I've never been sure whether I'm painting it out of love or out of grief, or out of some determination not to forget it. Probably all three. The figure was there long before I knew the will existed. I painted it because I always felt like someone ought to be standing at that window, holding something up, making themselves seen. And then you knew what the figure was holding," said Miss Marple. "And then I knew." A pause. "The teacup was for Karen. We've had that signal for years. Teacup on the outside sill means, 'I need you. Come when you can.' I put it there Monday morning before I left. I thought perhaps she'd pass by within a few days. I didn't know she was already coming. She told me you were kind to her when she was 16, said Miss Marple. Dorothy Hendricks looked at the hills for a moment. "She was a difficult girl," she said at last, with a warmth in the word difficult that had nothing of criticism in it and everything of affection. "She was prickly, and she was unhappy, and she worked very hard at not needing anyone. The only way through that, in my experience, is to be consistent, to keep looking at them the same way regardless of how they present themselves. Eventually they understand that you're not going to stop, and they let you in a little." She paused. "Most people just need to be properly seen. It's one of the things I believe most firmly, having been a teacher. You can do almost anything for a person if you're willing to see them accurately and without flinching." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I think that's right." The car turned into the Ferngate Crossing road, and the church tower appeared above the tree line in the last horizontal light of the afternoon, warm and solid and entirely itself. Miss Marple looked at it and thought, this is exactly the kind of afternoon that Dorothy Hendricks would have been painting, had she been free to paint it. Chapter 14. What the village made of it. The village of Ferngate Crossing processed the matter of Miss Hendricks and the Boswell will in the way that villages process such things thoroughly, at its own pace, with a collective narrative instinct that moved the story toward alignment with what the village had privately felt was true all along, and with a generosity toward the injured party that was one of the better qualities of communities that have known someone for a long time and have a genuine investment in their well-being. The first complete circuit of information took approximately 2 days. The corrections and refinements took another day and a half. By the end of the first week, the consensus version was approximately 75% accurate, which Miss Marple thought was rather better than one might hope, and somewhat better than the usual average for complex stories passing through informal channels. The missing 25% consisted largely of details that were either confidential or simply not available to informal report, and whose absence was probably correct. Mrs. Lorne at the post office received the essential facts with the composed, dignified satisfaction of a woman who has always known that something was not right and has been patient enough to wait for the knowledge to be confirmed in the world. She was not, by nature, a triumphant person. She did not enjoy being right at the expense of others being wrong. But there was a quality of quietness to her manner the following Thursday when Miss Marple came in for stamps, a settled, relieved quietness, The quietness of a concern that has finally been resolved, that was its own form of expression. "I always thought," Mrs. Lorne said, and left the sentence there, because leaving it there was the right thing to do. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "So did I." Mr. Atwell, when Miss Marple gave him a brief account of the essential events on the following Saturday, she had by this point a clear sense of what each person needed to know, and had tailored her accounts accordingly, said him once, with the quality of someone hearing something that confirms what he had observed, and right then once, with the quality of someone who has what he needs and is ready to get back to work. Then he returned to his current task, which was the late-season tidying of a boarder at Glebe House, and Miss Marple walked on. Constance Thurlow received the account at greater length and with more visible response, because Constance felt things with the full, honest depth of someone who has no particular desire to protect herself from the weight of what is true. 8 years, she said, holding her teacup in both hands. 8 years she's been carrying this, and she carried it alone. She was quiet for a moment. That's the thing about proud people. They don't want to be seen carrying a burden. They think being seen carrying it makes them smaller, and in fact it's the carrying alone that does that. She didn't want to seem like someone with a grievance, said Miss Marple. She didn't want to become her own injury. No. And she didn't. I've known her 12 years, and I've never once thought of her primarily as someone who was unjustly treated by her family. I've thought of her as a person who paints well and tends her garden carefully and is more interesting company than she quite lets on. Constance put down her cup, which is rather a testimony to her, in its way. Lavinia, who had accumulated the story from 3 sources before Miss Marple had a chance to provide the authorist version, sat opposite her cousin on the Thursday evening and asked a question she had been waiting to ask for several days with only moderate success. "You knew from the teacup," she said. "It was not a question." "I knew there was something that required attention," said Miss Marple. "You knew." Lavinia gave her the mild, fond look of a person who has tried and failed for 30 years to catch her cousin being more confident than she admits to. "You spoke to Mrs. Lorne and Atwell and Constance. You wrote to Clara about wills and property solicitors. You went to Dr. Prentice. You went to Sergeant Doyle. You went to Exeter." She counted these on her fingers. "All of that from a teacup on an outside windowsill." "All of that from a teacup on an outside windowsill," agreed Miss Marple. "And a chain on a door locked from the inside. And a car with 2 people in it parked outside a cottage in the evening, engine off. And a woman who looked behind herself in a lane on a Monday afternoon and saw someone she didn't want to see. And a doctor who said call the police rather than she's perfectly well. And 11 watercolors, one of which was hung slightly apart from the others." She picked up her teacup. "Small things. They are always small things. But there are very rarely large things, Lavinia. There are only small things that are allowed to accumulate until they can no longer be ignored, which is, in my experience, the most dangerous point, because by then it is very often quite late." Lavinia considered this. She was very brave, she said. "Extraordinarily," said Miss Marple. "Alone, frightened, facing people who wanted something from her and were prepared to be unpleasant in order to get it, and she thought quickly, and she acted on her thinking, and she was right. People who live alone sometimes develop a quality that looks from the outside like solitude, but is actually self-reliance. They know their own resources very precisely. They know what they can bear, and they know what they will not bear. Dorothy Hendricks knew that the document was her evidence and her protection, and that it needed to be somewhere safe, and she put it somewhere safe in the one way that occurred to her in the few hours she had. And then she followed it herself, which was either very courageous or slightly mad, and probably both. "Both," said Lavinia firmly. The fire burned quietly. The frost came in from the hills, finding the windows first, as frost does, and the village pressed its warmth inward against it. Chapter 15. The Teacup returned. On the Friday of the following week, when things were as settled as they were likely to be for some time, the solicitors having been engaged and the preliminary legal conversations having been initiated, and the document being in the custody of the appropriate. People and everything set in motion that needed setting in motion, even if the motion itself would take months or longer to reach any destination. Miss Marple walked to the early church service. It was the kind of October morning that the month produces, every few days, as though by way of apology for its general tendency toward gray and cold. Bright to the bone, a high, serious, pale blue sky, in which the sun was present and properly intentional, casting real shadows across the frost that lay on the grass of the green and along the tops of the stone walls in a thin white precision. The air was cold in the clear, clean way of good October air, the cold that makes you glad of a coat and grateful for the way the cold shows you the shape of things, the branches against the sky, the roof lines, the particular angular beauty of a village in winter preparation, all the summer, softness stripped away and the structure of things revealed. The wisteria vine at Wisteria End was at its most skeletal. The great vine that in spring consumed the entire front wall in cascades of purple and in summer made a dark, fragrant canopy of leaves, that vine was now reduced, or revealed, as the gray and complex network of its actual structure. Its decades of decision-making about direction and growth made, fully visible without their seasonal covering. You could see, in the naked vine, all the years of it, the main branches as thick as a man's arm near the base, thinner as they moved up and outward, the small subsidiary twigs at the ends still reaching. It was, in its winter state, one of the most beautiful things about the cottage, if you were the sort of person who found the architecture of growth beautiful, which Miss Marple was. Dorothy Hendricks was in her front garden. She was pruning the roses. Properly, thoroughly, with the correct secateurs and the correct angle, and the methodical attention of a person returning to a task that has been left too long and who is making it right without reproach to herself for the leaving. She was wearing her old green outdoor coat and her gardening gloves, and she had a bucket beside her for the cut stems, and she was working her way along the left-hand border with the focused, contented air of someone who is back in the right relationship with her garden, and is aware of the fact and glad of it. She looked up when she heard the tap of Miss Marple's stick on the pavement. A warm and genuine smile, not the managed, social smile of someone performing contentment, but the real kind, the kind that comes with no particular audience in mind. The smile of someone who is, on balance, all right and knows it. Good morning, Miss Marple. Good morning. The roses are getting a proper attention at last, I see. They have been patient, said Dorothy. She looked at the bush she was working on with the affectionate appraisal of a gardener assessing a plant that has endured something. More patient than they needed to be. But they'll be fine. Roses generally are, said Miss Marple. They look delicate, and they're not particularly. They endure a great deal more than you'd think if you only looked at the flowers. A pause settled between them, the comfortable, unhurried kind that belongs between people who have arrived at mutual understanding through an unusual route and who are at ease with each other in the specific way that comes from having been through something together and come out on the right side. I wanted to thank you, said Dorothy Hendricks, straightening and looking at Miss Marple properly. Not because I think you require it, I don't think you do, and I don't think you'd say you deserve it, but because it would be wrong not to say it. What you did, noticing what you noticed, and doing what you did with what you noticed, that mattered. It might have mattered a great deal more than we'll know, because these things are impossible to follow backward to what they prevented. It was the teacup, said Miss Marple simply. Outside is not where a teacup belongs. Once something is clearly in the wrong place, it becomes very difficult to not wonder why, and once you start wondering, you generally can't stop until you understand. That is really the whole of it. Dorothy Hendricks looked at the empty outside windowsill. It was pale and clean and slightly damp from the frost, and entirely, properly itself, a windowsill without anything on it that shouldn't be there. I put the teacup there on Monday morning before I left, she said. I was thinking of Karen. We've had that signal for years. It started when she used to drive through occasionally, and didn't want to ring in case I was sleeping. Teacup on the sill means, I need you. Come when you can. I thought perhaps she'd pass by within a day or two and see it. A slight pause. I didn't think anyone else would notice. People notice more than they're given credit for, said Miss Marple. Villages especially. The seeing is there, in most places. It sometimes just needs a little encouragement toward usefulness. Dorothy smiled again. Then she looked at the cottage, at the wisteria vine, at the old stone, at the familiar and imperfect and entirely sufficient home it had been for 12 years, and would continue to be, through whatever the lawyers managed or failed to. Outside, a dog announced an opinion from somewhere near thee. Lamb and anchor. The baker's bicycle went back the other way, the morning delivery completed. A woman, Miss Marple, didn't know well emerged from the house at the corner with a shopping bag, and nodded, and Miss Marple nodded back. These small and ordinary things, these tiny morning transactions, these negligible acknowledgments between people who live in the same place and see each other regularly and have no great urgency to exchange, they were, in their way, the point. They were the whole of it. It was breathing, slowly and steadily and without difficulty. The long, quiet, unhurried breath of a house that has been here a long time, that knows the seasons, that has weathered more than one difficult year and absorbed more than one difficult thing, and that remains, through all of it, precisely and unshakably itself. As all the best places are, as all the best people are, quietly, stubbornly, beautifully themselves.